The Bee Gees' musical legacy is unquestionably monumental, and with HBO's recent release of their new Bee Gees documentary, the quintessential late 70s rock band seems to be back in the spotlight once again. Not like they ever really left. While we can easily recognize the lasting impact the Bee Gees had on rock music, the disco scene, etc., we sometimes gloss over the unofficial Bee Gee. I'm Nostalgic Nick, and today we're going to take a look back at the incredible and tragic life story of Andy Gibb, the younger non-Bee Gee sibling of Barry, Robin, and Maurice, who was known for his knee-buckling good looks and songwriting prowess, but perhaps not as respected as his older brothers. Was Andy just a victim of the lofty expectations imposed on him by his brother's success, or was there something darker going on? If you enjoyed this throwback, be sure to give it a thumbs up for us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you never miss a video. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Baby Bee Gee on the rise. Andy, the youngest of 5 children, was born on March 5th, 1958, in Stratford, Lancashire. Andy and his family moved all over Australia, between Queensland, Brisbane, and Sydney. During this adolescent period of his life, Andy was known to be quite a rebellious mischief maker. His mother, Barbara, once described Andy as a little devil. She said he would, quote, sneak off to the stable and sleep with his 2 horses all day, when apparently he was supposed to be at school. Andy returned to the UK in the mid-60s, right around when his brothers were starting to find international fame. But then his parents moved to the Spanish island of Ibiza, and at just 13 years old, Andy quit school and picked up the guitar in the hopes of following in his brother's footsteps. He formed a band called Melody Fair, named after a Bee Gees song, and it was managed by Andy's mother, Barbara. At the recommendation of his brother Barry, who also provided him with his first guitar, he returned to Australia with some of his Melody Fair bandmates to kickstart his music career. It was during this period that Andy and his bandmates recorded a bunch of demo tracks, one of which he performed on the Ernie Sigley Show, a late-night Australian variety program. And after listening to one of Andy's demo tapes, his brother's manager, Robert Stigwood, signed him on. He was known to many as the Baby Bee Gee, a label that he despised, but nonetheless always stuck with him. Andy longed to make a name for himself. He had his own talent, and probably struggled with the idea that people thought he was just famous because his brothers were talented. Nevertheless, he loved his brothers, and never denied their help or influence. In 1977, with the help of his brother Barry, he released his debut album, Flowing Rivers. The album included hits like I Just Wanna Be Your Everything and Love Is Thicker Than Water, the latter of which was co-written by Barry. Surprisingly, I Just Wanna Be Your Everything was such an insane success that it reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and Love Is Thicker Than Water beat out the Bee Gees' Stayin' Alive Billboard spot. Andy proved that this Baby Bee Gee was a force to be reckoned with. But despite his chart-topping successes, it didn't seem to be enough to make Andy happy, and behind the scenes, things were getting darker, falling apart. Why would someone who had made such a successful name for himself have such a dark cloud hanging over him? That was the big question for Andy Gibb. Andy seemed to constantly feel like he was living in the shadow of his brothers. He tried to make a life for himself, but couldn't seem to live up to his own lofty expectations. At 19, he married Kim Reeder, an 18-year-old receptionist, and they eloped in West Hollywood. But according to Kim, right around the time she was pregnant with their daughter, Peta, Andy became, quote, ensconced in the drug scene. She said, quote, cocaine became his first love. He wasn't the man I married. In 1978, Kim flew back to Australia where she gave birth to Peta, and soon after divorced Gibb. As the allure of disco began to fade in the 80s, Andy began to spiral further and further into a drug-fueled stupor. In 1981, Andy met actress and singer Victoria Principal, who we talk about more in our deep dive episode from the hit soap Dallas. So check that out next. They met on the John Davidson Show. They made headlines with their duet love song, All I Have to Do Is Dream. Andy found love and was back on the charts, but he still couldn't kick his persistent drug habit. And after 13 months, the famous relationship had ended. Gibb said he, quote, fell apart and didn't care about anything. He was doing cocaine around the clock, around $1,000 a day. Yikes. One more chance.
I'm about to sign my new record deal, which I can do now with no pressure. And everybody seems to think that, I'm really suffering through all the headlines. It's great for me.
New opportunities were coming around the bend for Andy. Unfortunately, as bright as these horizons looked, his stunted ego made him unable to rise to the occasion. In 1981, he was given a starring role in a Los Angeles production of the play, The Pirates of Penzance. He was absolutely infatuated with the reaction he got on opening night, but unfortunately, every other night wouldn't turn out to have the glamour of his opening night performance, and his depression started to take the reins again, and he began missing shows. He was later given an opportunity to co-host the syndicated TV show Solid Gold with Marilyn McCoo, but Gibb was fired for, surprise surprise, repeatedly missing shows, and thus continued his downward trend. His former manager Stigwood said that Andy became so paranoid that he couldn't fly on public airplanes, and quote, blew millions on private planes. His behavior had become erratic. His family eventually persuaded Andy to face his cocaine problem, and in 1985 he briefly entered the Betty Ford Center in California, but it didn't work because he entered another facility the following year. Despite all the support he had, he was still unable to clean himself up, and the public's support for Andy was waning fast. An Arrow Through the Heart. Andy attempted a public comeback, guest starring on several television sitcoms including Gimme a Break and Punky Brewster. Then he went back on tour in East Asia and regularly performed shows in Las Vegas and Lake Tahoe. Things were really starting to look up for the crestfallen pop sensation. But could this baby BG really establish a legacy of his own this late into his career? In 1987, he completed another rehabilitation program and returned to the studio that very year. One of the songs he recorded was aptly named Arrow Through the Heart, about a man's, quote, vain search for happiness. Sadly, this would prove to be his final musical endeavor. In 1988, just 2 days after celebrating his birthday, Andy Gibb went into a hospital in Oxford, complaining of chest pains. 3 days later, Gibb died of myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart brought on by years of cocaine abuse. While Andy's life was short, his legacy still lives on. And in 2010, the Bee Gees released Mythology, a 4-disc set with each disc highlighting a Bee Gee brother, including the unofficial Bee Gee, Andy. What would Andy's career have culminated into if it weren't cut so short? There were rumors that in the final years of his life, Andy was going to finally join his brother's band and become an official Bee Gee. But things didn't pan out that way. At least he left a legacy of some really great music of his own. To many, Andy seemed to have it all, but none of it was enough to make him happy. We can only remember and sing along. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also give us some suggestions who we should dive into next. Tell us in the comments below. And while you're there, tell us your favorite Andy Gibb song or favorite Andy Gibb memory. And if you have a friend who is a Gibb fan, why don't you share this video with them? We would really appreciate it. From all of us here at Do You Remember, thanks so much for watching.